There are moments in history that feel as though someone has pressed a finger against the surface of time itself, smudging the outline of what should be clear. And sometimes, it is not what is found that unsettles the mind, but what is missing. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you're listening right now, whisper your location and your local time into the comments, as if you were sending a quiet signal across the night. The oldest stories of humanity should have been simple. They should have unfolded layer by layer, showing us a gradual climb from scattered tribes to organized cities. But in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the pattern breaks. Civilization does not rise slowly there. It appears as though someone opened a door and an entire world stepped out fully formed. Scholars have noticed this for more than a century, yet the silence surrounding the anomaly feels thicker than ever. Why did the earliest writing system in human history arrive complete, with no clear evolutionary steps? Why did cities like Eridu and Uruk seem to bloom out of a kind of cultural darkness, as if awakening from a forgotten dream? This is where the listener begins to drift into the first veil of uncertainty. Archaeologists call it a cultural explosion. Historians call it the birth of civilization. But the Sumerians themselves called it something else entirely. In their own texts, they described knowledge descending from a place beyond the human world, arriving in the hands of figures who walked out of the deep waters or the open sky. These are myths, of course, yet every myth begins as a memory before it becomes a story. And it is the shape of that memory that refuses to fit neatly into the textbooks. Consider for a moment the earliest cuneiform tablets ever found. They do not show a young writing system trying to form its first symbols. They do not show a clumsy attempt at communication. Instead, the first tablets already contain accounting systems, legal records, standardized signs. It is like discovering the first page of human writing and realizing it is already an archive. This lack of a learning curve has troubled researchers since the 1930s. But the question rarely leaves academic walls, as though approaching it requires a kind of quiet caution. If one follows that caution deeper, the landscape becomes stranger. The earliest cities in southern Mesopotamia appear at a scale that suggests planning. Grid-like streets, organized temple districts, irrigation networks stretching for miles. Yet the people who built them seem to step into the archaeological record with no clear ancestors who practiced anything remotely similar. There are hints, of course, scattered proto-symbolic markings, fragments of pre-pottery cultures, fading footprints of villages that came before. But the bridge between these early settlements and the sudden brilliance of Sumer remains fragile, almost transparent. Something is missing, either from the soil or from the story. The absence becomes even more troubling when one looks at the Sumerian language itself. It is a linguistic isolate, a language with no known relatives, no clear evolutionary path. Most languages have cousins, but Sumerian stands alone, like an orphaned branch of an unknown tree. Philologists still debate its origins, but the debate never seems to close. It simply drifts, unresolved, like a whisper lost between desert winds. And then there is the deeper silence, the silence that stretches before the first temple, before the first seal, before the first name carved in clay. Archaeology reveals brief glimpses of older layers, traces beneath Eridu that suggest activity long before the official founding of the city, unexpected sophistication in pottery and metallurgy long before the supposed dawn of civilization. These layers are thin but persistent. They imply a prelude, a forgotten chapter, a ghost civilization beneath the one we celebrate as humanity's beginning. Yet every time the narrative seems ready to reveal this earlier world, the trail fades. Flood layers erase evidence, Ancient fires consume archives. Clay disintegrates. Stone is repurposed. And somewhere within this erasure, patterns of discontinuity appear. Sudden architectural changes, abrupt cultural shifts, technologies that seem to appear without precedent. It is as if someone struck a match in a dark room, letting it glow for a moment before blowing it out again. This uncertainty raises a question that echoes softly in the mind. What was here before Sumer? And why does everything before it feel intentionally muted, as if someone sanded away the fingerprints of time? Even modern scholars admit the strange compression of early Mesopotamian chronology. There are too many innovations packed into too short a period. Writing, astronomy, mathematics, monumental architecture, administrative bureaucracy. A civilizational toolkit that should have taken thousands of years seems to have condensed into a handful of centuries. It is not impossible. Human genius can accelerate under the right circumstances. Yet the acceleration remains peculiar enough to cast faint shadows of doubt. Perhaps the more haunting question is this: why do the Sumerians themselves say their knowledge was given, not invented? Their myths speak of gifts, laws handed down, arts taught by divine intermediaries, cities founded with celestial instructions. We modern listeners interpret this symbolically, but symbols often hide older truths. Were these metaphors for earlier cultures now lost? Encoded memories of migrations? Echoes of a forgotten people who left no names behind? Or does the silence conceal something deeper? Something resembling a rupture in human history? The truth may rest somewhere between archaeology and intuition, between clay tablets and dreamlike whispers of an older world. Whatever the origin, the pattern is undeniable. The story of humanity does not begin where we think it does. It begins in a gap, in a blank space on the page, where something should exist but does not. And that space is where the first Sumerian records seem to point, quietly, insistently, as if urging us to look past what is written and toward what has been erased. The deeper one travels into this silence, the more palpable it becomes. And somewhere beyond it, perhaps buried beneath the sands of Eridu, or submerged under the muddy layers of the Euphrates, lies the first piece of the puzzle we no longer know how to read. But if the first hint of the mystery begins here, with the sudden appearance of a civilization that should have had ancestors but does not, then the next step leads us into the tablets themselves, the fragments of clay that should not exist in their current form. And that step, fragile as a footprint in wet earth, opens the way into the second layer of the story. It is strange how the mind adjusts to uncertainty, how it learns to drift into the spaces between what is known and what is implied. When the last thought of the previous part begins to settle, there is a quiet unease hovering in its wake, as though the deeper layers of the story are only now beginning to reveal themselves. And if the earliest cities feel as if they emerged out of nowhere, then the earliest tablets cast an even longer shadow across the timeline. They appear not as hesitant experiments in writing, but as confident testaments to something already established. And when clay speaks too clearly too early, the silence behind it becomes difficult to ignore. The first recognizable cuneiform tablets appear around the late 4th millennium BCE in places like Uruk and Jemdet Nasr. Yet these are not the expected scribbles of a society still learning how to form its symbols. They are dense, structured, and systematically organized. They detail grain rations, temple allocations, labor counts, livestock totals. There is a precision to them, a kind of administrative maturity, that feels incompatible with the idea that writing had just been invented. The earliest tablets behave like the middle chapter of a story, not the beginning of one. Scholars have pointed out this anomaly since the 1950s, noting that a writing system should pass through slow stages. pictographs evolving into ideograms, ideograms transforming into phonetic signs. But the Sumerian tablets present a strange inversion. The earliest evidence already shows an advanced stage of bureaucracy. Archaeologists have tried to trace the evolutionary steps backward, searching for older examples of pre-writing in the region. There are proto-symbols in Upper Mesopotamia, clay tokens from the Near East dating back to the Neolithic, and seal impressions that hint at early administrative thought. But none of these fully explain the sudden sophistication of the Uruk tablets. They feel like echoes of a missing predecessor, as though the original script that should have led to the earliest cuneiform simply did not survive, or was never found. The gap remains open, quiet, unresolved. Even more troubling is the absence of mistakes. Early writing should be filled with inconsistencies, abandoned experiments, transitional symbols. Instead, what survives from the earliest layers is astonishingly coherent. The signs are already standardized, the layout follows patterns, the accounting methods are well established. It is almost as if the scribes were copying something older, something they already knew by heart, something that had existed long before clay tablets froze it into permanence. Some scholars hesitate to admit this directly, but the conversations are there. Footnotes in papers, murmurs in academic conferences, careful suggestions that the origin of writing in Mesopotamia may not be fully captured by the archaeological record. Every age of scholarship has its taboos, and the sudden appearance of structured literacy remains one of Mesopotamian studies' quietest riddles. Consider also the tablets discovered in the ruins of Kish, slightly different from those of Uruk, yet equally advanced in their structure. Their existence suggests not a single point of invention, but possibly multiple centers of early writing developing almost simultaneously, as though responding to an older system that predated both. Jemdet Nasser contributes yet another piece to the puzzle, with its colorful pottery and administrative texts appearing abruptly, then disappearing just as abruptly, leaving behind more questions than answers. There is something unusual about a script that emerges fully functional in several regions within such a narrow time frame. It hints at inheritance rather than invention. But inherited from whom? The question becomes more pressing when considering how quickly the script evolves in the centuries that follow. Within a few generations, cuneiform expands into mythological narratives, astronomical observations, medical texts, legal codes. This rapid diversification suggests the scribes already possessed the cognitive framework for literacy long before the first known tablets were created. They did not stumble their way into complex writing. They stepped into it with a familiarity that feels older than the clay beneath their hands. There are fragments of tablets that seem to belong to an even earlier tradition. Broken symbols, half-erased lines, traces of an archaic form of writing. But these fragments refuse to form a coherent lineage. They exist like isolated islands with no visible land bridges connecting them. Each one hints at a lost world of written communication that may have existed long before the archaeological timeline acknowledges it. The linguistic evidence deepens the puzzle. Sumerian as a language is unique, unrelated to any known linguistic family. If writing emerged suddenly in Sumer, one would expect its language to have younger roots or clearer connections. Instead, the opposite is true. The language appears ancient even in its earliest written form, filled with complexities that should have required centuries of spoken evolution. The script and the language do not behave like systems that were born together. They behave like the meeting point of two older traditions. This tension creates a quiet pressure beneath the surface of the narrative, a sense that something essential has been erased. And in Mesopotamia, erasure is not a metaphor. Archaeological layers reveal repeated destructions, floods that sweep away entire settlements, fires that consume temples and archives, conflicts that obliterate royal districts. Every few centuries, a catastrophe washes the slate clean, leaving only fragments behind. How many early steps toward writing were lost in this cycle of erasure? It becomes difficult not to wonder whether the earliest tablets we possess are simply the survivors of countless forgotten generations. What remains after fire, water, and time have consumed everything else. And if that is true, then perhaps the earliest writing is not the first attempt, but the last remnant of something older. There are also symbolic clues hidden within the early administrative records. Some tablets catalog not only grain and livestock, but offerings to deities whose origins appear mysterious even to later Sumerians. Some record measurements and weights that seem standardized beyond what a young civilization should possess. Others refer to rituals that imply a long-standing ceremonial tradition, as though the culture was already ancient when it first learned to write. The deeper one looks, the more the clay seems to whisper about a past that the text does not explicitly mention. It is not what the tablets say that unsettles the mind. It is what they assume the reader already knows. And then there are the anomalies. The tablets that defy chronological placement. Some appear older than they should be, while others show features expected only centuries later. Scholars attempt to fit them into conventional timelines, but a few pieces never sit comfortably within any framework. These outliers act like faint signals from a deeper layer of human history, one that has not been fully excavated or understood. If the earliest tablets should not exist in their current form, then the path ahead becomes even more obscure. What else in the Sumerian record behaves as though it belonged to an older world? And why do so many early texts refer to kings whose ages make no sense in human terms? Perhaps the next mystery lies not in the writing itself, but in the rulers who supposedly lived long before the first tablet was ever pressed into clay. Figures whose lifespans stretch across impossible spans of time. And somewhere between myth and record, their shadows wait for us in the next layer of the story. There is a peculiar stillness that settles in the mind when the clay tablets begin to blur into myth, when the certainty of administrative lists dissolves into something far older, stranger, and far less comfortable. If writing appears suddenly, then the people who claim to have ruled long before writing must belong to an even deeper stratum of the story, one that stretches across an impossible landscape of time. And this is where the Sumerian record grows unsettling, because it begins speaking in numbers that no human body could contain. Among the most enigmatic texts ever recovered from Mesopotamia is a document that, on its surface, should have been a simple chronological list. Instead, it became a quiet fracture in the timeline, the Sumerian king list. Its purpose was straightforward: record the succession of rulers from the earliest ages to the historical dynasties of Sumer. But nothing about its earliest lines obeys the laws of human life. Kings who reigned for centuries, kings who ruled for millennia, kings who lived through cycles of time that seem better suited to geological epochs than to human history. Scholars have long approached these reign lengths with caution, offering interpretations that keep the narrative grounded. Symbolic numbers, cosmological coding, mythological dramatization, literary embellishment. And yet, even after generations of study, the unease remains. If these reigns were symbolic, why were they recorded with such consistency? Why did multiple copies of the king list preserve the same impossible durations? Why did later scribes continue copying them, even when they themselves lived in a world defined by far more modest spans of life? Even more troubling is the way the ancient scribes framed the narrative. According to the king list, kingship descended from heaven. It began not with the founding of cities, not with social organization, but with an event, something descending, a handing down, a transfer. And only after this descent does the record begin listing rulers whose lives defy comprehension. The list speaks of the city of Eridu as the first place where kingship was established. Eridu, a city that archaeology confirms is indeed one of the earliest urban settlements on Earth, appears in both the mythological and the archaeological record, as though it existed at the edge of a forgotten age. And the kings who allegedly ruled there lived for tens of thousands of years. Some reigns stretch so far beyond biological possibility that even calling them symbolic feels like a fragile explanation. There are attempts to decode the numbers, dividing by 60, the Sumerian base, adjusting for lunar calendars, interpreting them as dynastic totals rather than individual lifespans. But none of these conversions fully resolve the anomaly. They merely reduce the scale of the impossibility without eliminating it. Whether symbolic or literal, whether astronomical encoding or cultural memory, the numbers cling to the record like ancient fingerprints, refusing to be smoothed away. The silence surrounding these kings is equally disquieting. For many of them, there are no known temples, no surviving inscriptions, no archaeological remains that can be confidently linked to their reigns. They exist purely in the written memory of later scribes, as if the earliest chapters of human civilization were faint echoes that persisted across ages of destruction, migration, and renewal. One detail often overlooked is how the list categorizes time. It divides the early world into epochs separated by an event described in 3 quiet words. Then the flood came. Long before the biblical story, long before later traditions shaped the narrative, the Sumerians recorded a catastrophic event that reset kingship, reset time, and reset humanity's place in the world. After the flood, the reign lengths dramatically contract, from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, then eventually to spans recognizable to modern human lifespans. This abrupt shift raises a question that lingers like a soft echo. What changed? Why did the world before the flood behave according to one set of rules, and the world after according to another? In some versions of the list, only 8 kings ruled before the flood. 8. Spanning thousands upon thousands of years. This pattern appears elsewhere in ancient traditions, cultures separated by geography and language, yet preserving variations of the same structure. A limited number of antediluvian rulers with impossibly long lives. Egyptian king lists. Berossus's Babylonian history. Fragments of Iranian and Indian kingship myths. Chinese annals. They all share the same strange architecture. Ancient rulers whose timelines stretch across eras that archaeology cannot fully map. One might dismiss these parallels as coincidence, as humanity's tendency to embellish its beginnings. But coincidences this consistent often hide something deeper. Some shared memory, distorted across millennia, that refuses to fully disappear. There is also a quieter, more intimate detail. The king list does not treat its earliest rulers as mythical. The tone remains administrative, matter of fact, almost clinical. It reads like a ledger, not a legend. And ledgers are not written to entertain. They are written to preserve. But preserve what? Some scholars propose that the early Sumerians were attempting to compress oral traditions spanning many generations into a linear structure. Others argue that the numbers reflect cycles of time, astronomical or ceremonial sequences encoded into the lives of symbolic kings. And then there are theories that treat the antediluvian rulers as metaphors for the development of early institutions, rather than individual humans. Yet even the safest theories cannot fully erase the timelessness embedded in these stories. There is a persistent sense that something is being translated, that a deeper memory is trying to pass through the thin membrane of recorded history, but the clarity has been dissolved by time. Another anomaly lies in the geographic shifts within the list. Kingship moves from city to city. Eridu to Bad Tibira, to Larak, to Sipar, to Shurupak. These sites span a wide area, some still poorly excavated, some only partially understood. Each migration of kingship feels like a fragment of a larger map, as though an older, region-wide system existed long before the cities themselves were built. It suggests continuity through destruction, civilizations rising atop the remnants of older ones, inheritance without documentation. The archaeological record complicates the picture further. Some of the cities mentioned in the antediluvian portion of the list have layers of occupation that do not align neatly with the chronology suggested by the text. Nothing fits perfectly, and perhaps that discordance is the point. Perhaps the earliest layers of human history were not meant to be captured in a simple linear progression. Perhaps they were cycles rather than steps, resets rather than ascents. It becomes difficult not to wonder whether the earliest kings represent more than rulers, whether they symbolize a world that operated under conditions we cannot fully imagine. A world whose scale of time and organization has been lost beneath collapsed strata and vanished languages. And when the king list transitions into the post-flood era, the tone changes subtly. The narrative contracts, becomes more earthly, more constrained. It is as if the story of humanity suddenly shrank, as if the world became smaller, quieter, dimmer. What happened during that transition? The clay does not answer. It only hints. It preserves fragments while allowing the rest to dissolve. And somewhere in that dissolution lies the tension between myth and memory, between the impossible ages of ancient rulers and the silence that follows them. If the rulers before the flood lived impossibly long lives, then perhaps the next step is to examine the cities beneath their supposed thrones. Layers of earth stacked like erased histories, waiting quietly for someone to listen. And those buried cities, hidden beneath other buried cities, hold the next veil of the mystery. There is something almost dreamlike about the way ancient cities bury themselves. They rise, they fall, they crumble, and then quietly, a new world builds itself on top of the old one, pressing it deeper into the earth until the memory of what came before becomes nothing more than a rumor carried by dust. And as the last thought of the previous part settles, the impossible kings, the timelines that stretch far beyond human limits, another contradiction emerges, softer but equally persistent. If those ancient rulers belong to an age that we no longer understand, then the ground beneath their supposed kingdoms should hold some trace of them. Yet every excavation seems to reveal not clarity, but layers upon layers of forgotten civilizations, as if history itself has been rewritten through sediment and silence. In places like Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash, the soil behaves like a palimpsest, a surface where older stories have been scraped away and overwritten, yet faint markings remain beneath the new text. Archaeologists digging into these cities describe the same haunting phenomenon. The deeper they go, the more complex the picture becomes. Instead of finding a simple beginning, they encounter multiple beginnings, stacked on top of one another like the pages of a book that has been rewritten too many times. Eridu, often called the earliest city in the world, contains more than 18 distinct architectural layers of its main temple alone. Each layer belongs to a different era, a different rebuilding, a different attempt to preserve something sacred. But what unsettles researchers is not the rebuilding itself. It is the abrupt shifts between layers. There are jumps in style, jumps in ritual practice, jumps in the sophistication of the structures, as though each reconstruction did not grow out of the previous one, but was transplanted from elsewhere. The continuity is broken. The evolution is not smooth. Something interrupts the narrative, again and again. The ground beneath Lagash tells a similar story. Entire sectors of the city appear to have been razed and rebuilt with designs that do not match the expected progress of their era. Fire layers appear abruptly, followed by periods of explosive growth. Then another quiet collapse, then another rebirth. The archaeological record here behaves like breath, expanding and contracting, rising and falling, not in a linear way, but in cycles. And every cycle leaves behind traces of a world that no longer exists. A world erased, but not entirely forgotten. Uruk is even more enigmatic. Beneath the monumental structures of the Uruk period lie older settlement layers that seem almost out of place. The construction techniques differ. The organization differs. The cultural signatures differ. It is as if the city rose out of the remains of something that belonged to a different rhythm of time. Scholars refer to this as cultural sedimentation, but the term itself feels insufficient. There is something deeper at work, some pattern of disappearance and reappearance that still resists coherent explanation. One detail often overlooked lies in the way these layers end. Many of the deepest, oldest layers do not taper off gradually. They end sharply, as if a sudden event interrupted the lives of the people who built them. Sometimes the interruption is fire, sometimes flooding, sometimes abandonment with no clear cause. But always, the break feels instantaneous, like the closing of a door. And when the door opens again centuries later, a different culture appears in the same place, creating the impression of a new beginning where continuity should have been. This pattern complicates everything we assume about the development of early civilization. A city should evolve gradually. Its architecture should show experimentation, mistakes, learning curves. But the earliest layers of Mesopotamian cities often lack these early signs. They appear with an unusual degree of completeness. Planned streets, organized temples, intricate irrigation systems. The foundations feel deliberate, almost as if they were modeled on something older, something unseen. The Sumerians themselves preserved hints of this in their myths. They spoke of earlier worlds, earlier destructions, earlier cities swallowed by waters or swallowed by time. They described cycles of creation and collapse, each one leaving behind fragments for the next world to reclaim. These stories are often dismissed as cosmological metaphors, but the ground of Mesopotamia seems to echo them with eerie precision. When archaeologists excavated Shuruppak, the city tied to the flood legend, they found layers of sudden destruction, followed by periods of recovery, then another destruction, each event separated by centuries. And beneath these layers, older settlement floors lie buried, silent, as if belonging to a world erased before the Sumerians ever emerged. Even cities not associated with flood legends like Kish reveal abandonment layers that coincide with environmental catastrophes, sudden droughts, sudden river shifts, sudden collapses. But the most haunting detail lies deeper still. Underneath some of the earliest Sumerian cities are settlement layers that do not resemble Sumerian culture at all. They belong to unknown groups whose identities remain a mystery. They left behind pottery styles that do not match later traditions, burial practices that do not align with Sumerian customs, and traces of structures that do not fit neatly into the known timeline. These layers feel like the shadows of civilizations that were here long before the names Sumer, Uruk, or Eridu existed. Civilizations without records, without writing, without clear connections to the world that came after. The existence of these older layers raises a quiet but persistent question. Were the Sumerians the beginning of something new, or the inheritors of something forgotten? There is another detail, one that archaeologists often mention with a careful tone. In some of the deepest layers under Eridu and Uruk, the soil contains unusual amounts of ash and debris that do not correspond neatly with known settlement destruction. Some layers show signs of extreme heat, the kind produced not by ordinary city fires, but by events intense enough to vitrify stone and clay. These are rare, subtle traces, too faint to build theories on, too persistent to ignore. They speak of catastrophes that left a little behind except the memory of a sudden ending. And then there is the problem of discontinuity in craft traditions. It appears in pottery, in metals, in architectural techniques. A tool or method will vanish from the record, only to reappear centuries later as if rediscovered or inherited through some unrecorded lineage. Knowledge resurfacing without documentation suggests one of two possibilities. Either the knowledge migrated from an unknown source, or it survived in a place that left no archaeological trace. The silence of these earlier worlds becomes louder the deeper one looks. It feels as though every shovel of soil uncovers not clarity, but more uncertainty, more vanished floors, more broken transitions, more hints of something that should still be here but isn't. And yet, through all this, the structure of the cities remains strangely disciplined. The rebuilding is never random. Each layer maintains a subtle respect for the one beneath it, as though following a memory of something older, something foundational. It is a continuity that should not exist in cities rebuilt after floods, fires, invasions, and collapses. But it does. And it suggests that even as civilizations fell, something about their blueprint survived. If the ground beneath Sumer's cities hides these older, erased worlds, then perhaps the next mystery lies not in the earth, but in the water. The floods that sweep across Mesopotamian history like repeating punctuation marks, each one closing a chapter before a new one begins. And that flood, the one that appears again and again in soil and story, waits for us in the next step of the journey. The deeper one travels into the layers of Mesopotamia, the more the earth begins to behave like a memory trying to speak. But memories can be fragmented, washed apart, rearranged by forces indifferent to human stories. And nothing erases a world more thoroughly than water. In the Sumerian record, water is not simply an element. It is a force of interruption, a boundary between ages, a curtain that falls and rises again when the world must be rewritten. And just as the buried cities of the previous part suggest cycles of destruction, the next veil in the story reveals something more repetitive, more insistent, a flood that seems to echo through both myth and soil, as though it were not a single event at all, but a recurring pattern that shapes everything beneath it. Long before the biblical narrative, before the Akkadian epics, before later traditions carried fragments of the story across continents, the Sumerians wrote about a flood that reset kingship, reset knowledge, reset humanity. They described it with an eerie simplicity. Then the flood came. No embellishment, no explanation, just a dividing line drawn across the ages. And what makes this line unsettling is that archaeology slowly began to confirm hints of something like it, though not in one place, and not in one moment, but as a rhythm of inundations that seemed to repeat across the land. In the city of Shuruppak, the deepest layers contain unmistakable traces of a massive flood, a thick deposit of river-borne silt that blankets earlier settlement floors. Potsherds found below this layer differ from those found above it, creating a clean division between two distinct cultural phases. Radiocarbon dates from the site suggest this flood occurred near the end of the 4th millennium BCE, a time frame that loosely aligns with later Mesopotamian flood narratives. But the story becomes more complex when turning to Kish. There, too, a flood layer appears, but not at the same depth or the same time. Kish's flood seems older, or perhaps newer. Scholars still debate. And the disparity invites the question, If these were real events, were they truly one flood, or were there many? Then there is the city of Ur. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed a similar layer of water-laid clay sealing off earlier levels. Leaning over the trench, Leonard Woolley, the excavator, believed he had found the evidence of the biblical flood itself. The newspapers repeated his interpretation eagerly, but even Woolley later admitted the layer did not stretch across the entire site, and certainly not across the entire region. It was localized. One flood among many. Not a global cataclysm, but something regional, perhaps cyclical. The more sites archaeologists examined, the more this pattern repeated. Flood layers existed, yes, but they varied by site, by depth, by century. Some were catastrophic, some were brief, some represented river shifts rather than weather events. And yet, they formed a pattern too persistent to dismiss, a pattern that aligns eerily with the structure of the Sumerian king list, with its sharp division between a long, obscure world before the flood and a shorter, more documented world after. Even the soil seems to remember more than the texts reveal. Stratigraphic cores taken from the Tigris-Euphrates basin show shifts, sudden ones, in sedimentation around periods of climatic instability. Pollen samples tell stories of drought and then sudden wet phases. Geological studies indicate episodes when the rivers swelled far beyond their banks, swallowing settlements and reshaping the land. Mesopotamia has always been a fragile cradle, balanced between abundance and destruction, where a slight shift in climate could render entire regions uninhabitable. But what troubles some researchers is not simply the frequency of these floods. It is the sense of suddenness, layer after layer that ends abruptly under sheets of water-deposited clay. Lives interrupted, cultures severed, histories erased. And then, after each erasure, new layers appear, often more advanced than the ones below, as though a reset had forced people to rebuild with memory rather than material continuity. This rhythm suggests a question rarely spoken aloud. How many civilizations did the rivers erase before writing began? How many stories slipped into the mud before anyone could carve them into clay? In certain sites, archaeologists have noted something even stranger. Beneath some flood layers, the pottery and architectural styles appear unrelated to those above, as if the people who rebuilt the cities were not direct descendants of those who had lived there before. This implies migration, replacement, or perhaps the survival of people elsewhere who returned to rebuild after the waters receded. And if that is true, then the flood myths may preserve something more profound than exaggeration. They may preserve memory of worlds that ended suddenly, leaving only fragments behind. In the Epic of Ziusudra, the Sumerian precursor to later flood narratives, the gods decide to destroy humankind with water. But one man is warned. He preserves knowledge, life, seeds. After the flood, kingship is re-established in a new city, and the world begins again. This story, often treated as metaphor, may contain echoes of real cycles of destruction and renewal that shaped Mesopotamian consciousness. Ancient people did not need to imagine floods. They lived through them. The land itself taught them the fragility of human achievement, but the consistency of the myths across cultures, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, suggests that Mesopotamia's floods may represent only one piece of a larger human memory. Could multiple regions have experienced catastrophic inundations during overlapping centuries? Could oral traditions have preserved these memories long before writing captured them? Modern climate researchers studying the abrupt end of the Younger Dryas period have noted sudden sea level rise events across the planet, events capable of reshaping coastlines and displacing populations. While these are far older than Sumer, the resonance is difficult to ignore. Human memory, even mythologized, often stretches deeper than archaeology can directly observe. The Sumerians spoke of the flood not just as a single catastrophe, but as a dividing force between ages. And perhaps the most haunting detail is how the king list presents the world after the flood. Shorter dynasties, shorter lives, shorter memories. It implies contraction, fragmentation, a reduction not only in lifespan but in knowledge itself. A world that once felt expansive becomes limited. A world that once seemed timeless becomes mortal. The flood becomes more than a geological event. It becomes a metaphor for the loss of something vast, something immemorial. But in the gaps left behind by water, something else emerges. The symbols and stones of cultures even older than Sumer. And these symbols, older than the floods and older than the first cities, point toward a deeper mystery, one carved not in clay, but in stone. And these stones, older than the rivers that washed civilizations away, wait in the next veil of the story. There is a strange comfort in thinking that history begins with writing, that humanity becomes visible only when clay remembers its hands. But the deeper one travels into the story, the less true that assumption feels. Because long before the first Sumerian sign was pressed into wet clay, long before the earliest cities rose beside the rivers, symbols were already speaking in a language older than history. A language carved not for record-keeping, but for remembrance, ritual, and meaning. And these stones, quiet and patient, sit like witnesses to a forgotten era, suggesting that the world Sumer inherited was not as empty as archaeology once believed. The people of ancient Mesopotamia never claimed to be the beginning. Their myths speak of earlier worlds, earlier beings, earlier cycles. Even their word for wisdom, me, is described as something bestowed, not invented. And when the first scribes of Sumer began to write, they did not carve new ideas. They preserved old ones, often with the tone of memory rather than creation. The question that lingers is simple. Memory of what? To approach that question, one must look beyond the cities of Sumer, farther upstream, into the highlands and plains of regions that existed long before the great flood layers of Mesopotamia. There, in the heart of southeastern Anatolia, an ancient hill once concealed a secret older than agriculture, older than pottery, older even than the idea of a settled village. And when the soil covering that hill was peeled back in the 1990s, something emerged that disrupted the expected order of human development. Vast megalithic enclosures arranged with meticulous planning, carved stones depicting animals and symbols, pillars shaped like immense stylized beings. The site is known today as Göbekli Tepe. What unsettled scholars was not only its scale, but its age. More than 11,000 years old, nearly twice as old as the earliest Sumerian cities. And even more perplexing, the builders of Göbekli Tepe appear to have been hunter-gatherers, groups traditionally thought incapable of organizing such monumental projects. There is no evidence of agriculture at the earliest levels, no permanent dwellings, no pottery. And yet, the stone pillars stand in silent circles, arranged along precise axes, carved with animals and symbols that suggest a complex symbolic world. The stones whisper something that clay does not. They suggest that organized ritual, complex symbolism, and perhaps even astronomical knowledge existed long before the civilizations of southern Mesopotamia. And if such symbolic mastery existed thousands of years before Sumer, then the Sumerian explosion of culture may not have been a beginning at all, merely the latest unfolding of a much older tradition. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Scattered across the Near East, earlier symbols appear like faint echoes, mysterious markings on stone dating back to the Natufian period, strange geometric patterns from Karahan Tepe, Enigmatic carvings from Navali Chori. These sites reveal a symbolic vocabulary that predates writing, yet conveys a sense of meaning and ritual sophistication. It is difficult not to imagine these symbols as the ancestors of later scripts, though the line of descent remains invisible, interrupted by millennia of silence. Even farther downstream in the Tigris Basin, archaeologists discovered abstract symbols carved into stone objects belonging to the Halaf and Ubaid cultures, cultures that predate the rise of Sumer. Spirals, chevrons, crosshatching, stylized figures. Some resemble later cuneiform signs, others seem unrelated to anything in the known record. These motifs appear on stamp seals, pottery, and amulets, objects that suggest ritual use, identity marking, or communication of protected knowledge. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these symbols is how they vanish and reappear. A motif might appear in a Neolithic site, then disappear for 1,000 years, only to resurface in a Sumerian temple. This discontinuity challenges the idea of linear development. Instead, it hints at a symbolic memory carried forward across ages, even through collapse, migration, and flood. One particular symbol, the so-called H symbol, appears at Göbekli Tepe, at Karahan Tepe, in Proto-Elamite inscriptions, and even occasionally in early Mesopotamian iconography. No one knows what it meant. Its recurrence across millennia suggests a cultural thread that archaeologists have not yet traced. A thread connecting worlds separated by thousands of years. There are also the stone figurines and zoomorphic carvings scattered across the Fertile Crescent, objects whose functions remain enigmatic. Some may represent protective spirits, others ritual identities, others perhaps mythic beings. These objects carry a sense of meaning that predates writing but feels too deliberate to be random. They point to a symbolic universe that existed long before history recognized it. This leads to a quiet but profound question. If people possessed such complex symbolic systems before agriculture, before cities, before writing, then what happened to the knowledge that produced them? Where are the missing centuries of development between these ancient stones and the first Sumerian tablets? The gap is vast, thousands of years. And yet, the sophistication of earlier symbols implies continuity, not rupture. Something must have bridged these eras, carried through oral tradition, ritual practice, or perhaps even proto-writing systems that leave no trace on stone or clay. Writing may have been invented more than once, lost and rediscovered, erased by floods or migrations, resurfacing only when conditions allowed. When viewed from this angle, the sudden appearance of Sumerian writing feels less mysterious. Perhaps it was not sudden at all. Perhaps it was the culmination of an older symbolic lineage whose earliest chapters eroded away. But the absence of clear continuity continues to cast long shadows. A similar mystery appears in the pottery traditions of the Halaf and Ubaid cultures, cultures that flourished before Sumer. Their ceramics display remarkable precision, symmetry, and motifs that seem almost mathematical. Later Sumerian pottery is simpler by comparison, more utilitarian. How did a civilization known for its intellectual blossoming emerge after cultures whose craftsmanship appears, in some respects, more refined? It is not that Sumer lacked artistry, far from it. But the reversal of complexity in certain domains creates a sense of discontinuity, a sense that the knowledge that flowed into Sumer came from multiple sources, some preserved, others forgotten. And perhaps the erased sources were tied to older pre-flood worlds whose artifacts did not survive the cycles of destruction recorded in soil and myth. Another quiet anomaly lies in the orientation and alignment of early sites. Some pre-agricultural enclosures appear aligned with celestial events, solstices, star risings, lunar cycles. Such alignments imply sustained observation over generations, a tradition that would later flourish in Sumerian astronomy. But the oldest evidence lies in stone, far older than any clay tablet of the first astronomers. It suggests not invention, but inheritance. All of this forces one to reconsider the meaning of first. The Sumerians may have been the first to write in clay, but not the first to think symbolically, not the first to carve meaning into the world, not the first to build monuments aligned with the sky. Beneath their achievements lies a deeper, older substrate, a symbolic memory stretching across ages, reshaped and forgotten, but never fully erased. And if the stones whisper of worlds that predate the flood, the cities and the kings, then perhaps the next step is to return to the Sumerians' own beginning, to the oldest of their cities, the city they believed was the first home of kingship. And beneath the foundations of that city lies another layer of the mystery. In the quiet hours of night, when thought softens and the mind drifts toward the threshold between waking and dreaming, there are places in history that begin to glow faintly. Places where the first outlines of civilization shimmer through layers of dust, memory, and myth. Among these places, one city stands apart, wrapped in a silence older than writing itself. The Sumerians called it their first city, the place where kingship descended, the point from which human order unfolded after the chaos of earlier ages. They called it Eridu. Eridu is more than an archaeological site. It is a riddle etched into the desert floor, a riddle whose earliest chapters seem to belong to a world that no longer exists. And when the story turns toward that ancient mound of earth and broken brick, the previous mysteries, older symbols, forgotten cities, untraceable kings, begin to gather around it like shadows, whispering of something deeper concealed beneath the sand. Eridu sits at the southern edge of Mesopotamia, near what was once the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf. Today the sea has retreated far away, but thousands of years ago the shoreline lapped close to the city's foundations. The Sumerians themselves remembered Eridu as the place where the world was first ordered, where the first temple was built, where the gifts of civilization took form. And yet, when archaeologists finally uncovered its layers, what they found did not resemble a simple origin story. It resembled a collapse of timelines, a series of sudden appearances, disappearances, and reappearances that made the city feel less like a beginning and more like a palimpsest of forgotten worlds. The main temple at Eridu, Iabzu, was rebuilt again and again over thousands of years. Archaeologists counted more than 18 distinct construction phases stacked directly on top of one another, each representing a different era. But the deeper they dug, the more disquieting the pattern became. The earliest layers did not show crude, experimental architecture. They showed deliberate construction, aligned with precision, performed by hands that seemed to already know what a temple should be. This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of Eridu. Its earliest sacred structures, the ones closest to the ground that predates history, appear unexpectedly mature. Not the work of a culture just discovering itself, but the imprint of something older, something inherited. Scholars have noted this anomaly with quiet restraint, but the implication lingers. The people who built the first temple in Eridu were not learning how to build. They were remembering how to restore. Even more strange is the absence of a clear village preceding the temple. In most early cities, religious structures evolve from domestic spaces. At Eridu, the opposite seems true. The temple came first. The settlement grew around it. It is as if the place was designated sacred before it was lived in, as if its significance preceded its inhabitants. The Sumerians would later say that Eridu was the home of the god Enki, the keeper of wisdom, the lord of fresh water and deep knowledge. Whether symbolic or literal, the myth reflects a truth carved into the earth. Eridu was built with purpose long before its society matured around it. The settlement layers surrounding the temple contain clues, but they do not resolve the mystery. They show transitions, from hunter-gatherer groups to settled villagers, from early huts to organized houses. But the temple remains the constant axis around which everything else turns. It is the one feature that persists through destruction, rebuilding, drought, and flood. And perhaps that persistence is the key. Eridu did not simply evolve, it endured. One of the most intriguing questions surrounding Eridu lies in the sharp changes between construction phases. At times, new building layers appear with no gradual transition from earlier ones. Techniques shift abruptly. Layouts change dramatically. It is as if the city periodically rebooted, new rulers, new traditions, new ideas emerging suddenly rather than through slow cultural growth. These breaks resemble the resets seen in other Sumerian cities. But Eridu's are older, deeper, closer to the threshold of prehistory. Even stranger is the presence of what appear to be ritual deposits beneath early temple floors, objects placed deliberately, sealed beneath mud brick, unseen by any future worshipper. Some contain shells from distant shores, others contain pigments, miniature vessels, carvings of fish or serpents. Their meanings remain unknown, but they suggest a ceremonial vocabulary that predates writing and persists across millennia. These rituals seem to echo practices found at much older Neolithic sites far to the north, hinting at cultural connections stretching across vast distances and deep time. If Eridu absorbed traditions from older symbolic worlds, then its earliest layers might represent the convergence of multiple cultural lineages. Some carried through migration, others through ritual memory, others perhaps through survivors of catastrophic floods or collapses recorded in later myths. This might explain the architectural leaps, the abrupt transitions, the sense of continuity without clear ancestry. But even this possibility raises another question. Why Eridu? Why did the Sumerians designate this place, above all others, as the origin point of kingship and order? The answer may lie in the geography itself. The landscape around early Eridu was unstable, subject to shifting shorelines, rising and receding waters, marshlands that changed shape with each generation. This instability makes the city's persistence even more remarkable. It endured floods, droughts, and the transformation of the region from coastline to desert. And through it all, the temple remained the heart of the settlement. Its repeated rebuilding suggests deliberate preservation, almost a guardianship of memory. Moreover, the earliest Sumerian myths describe Eridu as the place where the cosmic laws, arts, and foundations of civilization, were kept. These were not inventions of the Sumerians, but sacred gifts, relics of a world that existed before their own. Mythologically, the city functioned as a vault of inherited knowledge. From an archaeological viewpoint, the idea that Eridu preserved older traditions is not entirely unreasonable. Its earliest inhabitants may have been descendants of much older cultures displaced by climate change or rising waters in earlier millennia. If symbolic traditions from sites like Göbekli Tepe or Nevali Chori traveled southward through generations of migration, Eridu could have been the final refuge where fragments of ancient memory were rebuilt into new forms. But the deepest silence lies in what has not been found. The very earliest layers beneath the lowest temple foundation have not yielded clear evidence of their builders. There are occupation traces, yes, hearths, tools, but nothing that explains the sudden emergence of a fully formed sacred structure. Nothing that reveals who decided that this place was sacred long before history began. This absence resembles the pattern seen in the first tablets, in the first cities, in the king list. A missing prelude, a vanished chapter. As Eridu transforms across millennia, it eventually declines, its sacred centrality fading. By the time later Sumerian cities rise to prominence, Eridu has already begun its long, quiet retreat into myth. But its origins continue to radiate through the culture, in flood stories, in myths of divine wisdom, in the structure of kingship. Even when Eridu's bricks crumble, its imprint remains, shaping civilizations that no longer remember why the city mattered. And if Eridu survives more in myth than in stone, perhaps the next step is to follow the Sumerians' gaze upward, toward the sky they believed guided their cities, regulated their rituals, and encoded the order of the world. Because in their earliest records, another silence waits, written not in clay or stone, but in the stars. There is a certain softness that comes when a civilization lifts its eyes from the earth and begins to trace meaning in the sky. Something changes in the rhythm of its thoughts. The ground becomes a place of survival, but the heavens become a place of memory. And for the Sumerians, who look to the sky not for poetry, but for order, the dome above their cities acted like another archive, older than clay, older than kings, older even than the deserts beneath their feet. If Eridu offered a glimpse into a forgotten foundation on earth, then the constellations and celestial records of early Mesopotamia suggest another inheritance, one that came from a past even harder to grasp. When one moves slowly from the temple floors of Eridu into the depths of Sumerian astronomical thought, the shift feels almost seamless, as if the sky was simply another layer of their oldest city. The Sumerians observed stars with a precision that would take other civilizations thousands of years to match. Yet their earliest star lists do not resemble a young science discovering itself. They resemble a continuation, a tradition already matured by the time it was written down. One of the earliest known astronomical compilations is the MUL.APN series, a catalog of constellations, star risings, planetary observations, and calendar instructions. But even though MUL.APN is preserved in later copies, scholars agree the knowledge it contains is much older, rooted in the 3rd millennium BCE or even earlier. What is strange, and seldom discussed outside specialist circles, is how complete the system already is. The Sumerians did not record the gradual development of their astronomy. They recorded a finished structure. Their constellations already form a coherent celestial map. Their calendar already synchronizes lunar and solar cycles. Their observations already reflect an understanding of seasonal timing, navigation, and omen interpretation. It is not the knowledge itself that unsettles, but the absence of a visible developmental path. Nowhere do we see the trial and error of a civilization learning to read the sky. We see only the mastery. This mastery hints at something else: long-term observation, spanning generations before writing existed. Tracking star risings requires decades of careful recording. Identifying predictable planetary cycles requires centuries. And yet, the Sumerians' earliest astronomical references appear confident, almost familiar, as though they were not discovering celestial order, but preserving it. Some scholars suggest that the earliest astronomers inherited oral traditions of star knowledge from unknown predecessors, migratory groups, pastoral observers, or even remnants of Neolithic cultures who tracked the sky long before the first cities. If the people who built sites like Göbekli Tepe observed the heavens, then their symbolic carvings might encode an astronomy far older than Sumer's. This possibility casts a long shadow across time, connecting stone circles in Anatolia to temple ziggurats in southern Mesopotamia, linking symbolic memory to written record. Yet even without invoking deep prehistory, the Sumerian evidence remains troubling. Consider the Enuma Anu Enlil tablets, an extensive omen series analyzing celestial patterns. These texts show an advanced understanding of planetary retrograde motion, eclipses, and lunar cycles. While later Babylonian astronomers refined the system, its Sumerian roots are undeniable. But who began this tradition? What lineage of observers preceded the scribes who finally wrote the omens down? Even more peculiar is how the Sumerians interpreted celestial knowledge. They did not treat the sky as an object to study. They treated it as a language to decode. Stars were not distant worlds. They were signs. The heavens were a tablet, written long before humanity learned to write on clay. And within their mythology lies a subtle suggestion that the order of the sky existed before the order on earth, and that mortal kingship, laws, and rituals were reflections of a cosmic structure. This idea, cosmic order preceding earthly order, aligns with the anomalies previously encountered. Cities appearing mature before their developmental curve, writing emerging fully formed, kingship descending rather than evolving. The Sumerians seem to believe that knowledge flowed downward, not upward, that civilization was a reflection, not an invention. One of the most intriguing clues lies in the alignment of early temples and cities. Scholars have noted that certain structures in Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur appear oriented toward cardinal points or specific star risings. These alignments would have required careful and repeated observations over long periods, and these observations must have begun before the cities themselves were built. The builders of Sumer's earliest monuments were not merely architects, they were sky watchers. The question becomes, how long had they been watching? To observe heliacal star risings accurately, one must track a star's annual reappearance at dawn for many years. To establish reliable calendars, one must blend solar, lunar, and stellar cycles. The Sumerians succeeded in this with remarkable precision. Their calendar system, based on a lunisolar model, was sophisticated enough to require periodical intercalation, a technique that arises only after generations of accumulated observation. Such a system does not emerge spontaneously. Even more intriguing are the star names themselves. Some Sumerian constellations have no obvious relationship to their later Greek counterparts, suggesting that the Sumerian celestial map derived from a tradition independent of Mediterranean influence. Yet other constellations seem strikingly similar across distant cultures, raising questions about shared ancestral astronomy. Fragments from later Mesopotamian texts hint at star traditions older than Sumer. But the fragments are scattered, damaged, incomplete. They behave like the missing proto-writing, like the pre-Sumerian settlements, like the erased layers beneath the oldest cities. They imply an origin but do not reveal it. There is also the question of how Sumerian cities interacted with the sky. Their ziggurats, stepped temples rising toward the heavens, were not merely architectural feats. They acted as observation platforms. Each level brought priests closer to the horizon lines they studied, the risings and settings that announced seasons, rituals, and cosmic order. These structures echo earlier mound-building traditions found across Eurasia, though the connections remain faint and speculative. But perhaps the most haunting silence lies within the earliest star lists. They reference constellations whose identities remain unknown, whose symbolic meanings are lost. Some appear briefly in a single tablet, and then vanish from the tradition. Others survive only in damaged fragments. It is as if the earliest astronomers were recording a sky that no longer exists, or a sky interpreted through a worldview we can no longer reconstruct. One constellation in particular, Emuldagt K, appears to represent an ancient celestial marker whose function remains unclear. Some scholars propose it was linked to a star no longer visible due to precession of the equinoxes. If true, then this star may have been significant to observers thousands of years before Sumer. And if precession influenced Sumerian astronomy, then their knowledge must have spanned centuries longer than the archaeological record currently acknowledges. The idea that their earliest observations could reflect sky positions from a much older epoch continues to trouble researchers. It suggests that the astronomical system the Sumerians inherited was calibrated in a time before their cities existed, a time whose memory survives only in star names and ritual calendars. And if their celestial knowledge was inherited, then the question that rises gently but persistently is this: inherited from whom? The Sumerians would have answered with myth, gods, sages, beings who shaped order. Modern scholars answer with lost cultures, migrations, or early pastoral astronomers. But every answer feels incomplete, because the deeper one goes into Sumerian astronomy, the more it resembles a window into a forgotten lineage, one written in stars, not clay. And if the heavens served as the memory of a world erased on Earth, then perhaps the next mystery lies in the stories the Sumerians preserved. The myths that seem to echo events older than history, encoded in poetic language and divine metaphor. Because in their myths, another layer watches from the shadows. There is a certain tenderness in the way myths survive. They drift across centuries like faint reflections on water, distorted, fractured, shimmering with meanings no longer fully understood. And yet, within their imagery, one sometimes senses the outline of something older than the stories themselves, as though myth were not invention, but compression, a way of folding an impossible memory into a shape fragile enough to survive the passage of eras. When the Sumerians wrote their myths, they did not treat them as fantasies. They treated them as records, veiled, symbolic, but anchored in experiences that preceded the clarity of writing. And in that gentle ambiguity, another layer of the larger mystery begins to reveal itself. If the sky served as a cosmic archive, and if Eridu held the architectural echo of a forgotten world, then the myths that flowed through Sumerian temples acted like the spoken memory of that world. Not a literal account, but something softer and more elusive, a residue of ancient experiences filtered through generations of ritual. These stories, recited in a low chant for thousands of years, describe worlds before the flood, worlds of creation and destruction, worlds in which knowledge is not invented but bestowed. They describe cycles, not progress, eras rising and dissolving like sand carried by wind. What is peculiar is how often the Sumerians framed their myths as transmissions, not compositions. Their stories frequently begin with the gods revealing something, restoring something, handing down something forgotten. There is remarkably little triumph about discovery. Instead, there is longing, a sense of remembering. And behind this longing lies a silence, a suggestion that the storytellers themselves felt the presence of earlier ages whose outlines they could no longer fully see. One of the oldest Sumerian narratives, the tale of Enki and the creation of the Me, describes civilization not as a human invention, but as a collection of cosmic principles: wisdom, artistry, kingship, music, law, brought out from the deep, from the Abzu, the primordial waters. In mythological terms, this is a divine act. In symbolic terms, it resembles a memory of inheritance, something emerging from a hidden depth, something older than the people who received it. Another story, the myth of Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, describes a time when humanity spoke a single language, before the confusion of tongues scattered cultural unity across the world. This echoes later traditions, but its Sumerian form is more restrained, almost wistful. It describes the rupture as something sudden, an abrupt fragmentation that reshaped human communication. Whether symbolic or metaphorical, the story hints at a lost coherence, a world once connected before slipping into division. And then there is the Epic of Gilgamesh, whose oldest layers reach deep into Sumerian oral history. The epic contains fragments of earlier legends, heroes who travel to find lost wisdom, cities destroyed and rebuilt, immortality sought and denied. But what lingers most is the flood narrative embedded within it, a story that recurs across cultures like an echo of a shared trauma. When Utnapishtim recounts the destruction of the earlier world, his voice carries a tone of resignation, not shock. The flood is not unprecedented. It is part of a cycle, a resetting, a familiar ending. Myths across the Fertile Crescent carry similar fragments. A golden age interrupted by catastrophe, knowledge saved by a single survivor, cities founded and refounded upon ancient ruins, beings who walk between worlds, gifts handed down from realms beyond ordinary human experience. None of these traditions belong strictly to Sumer. They appear again in Akkadian, Babylonian, Syrian, and even distant Indo-European narratives, as if carried along ancient networks of memory. And while each culture reshapes the stories, certain motifs refuse to disappear. One such motif is the presence of wise intermediaries, figures who guide humanity after catastrophe. In Sumerian tradition, these are the Apkallu, semi-divine sages who emerged before the flood, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and then retreated into the deep. After the flood, their descendants, less powerful, more human, continue to instruct kings. Scholars often treat the Apkallu as mythic personifications of early priesthood or astronomy. But the mythology is careful in its distinction. The pre-flood sages are different. They belong to an earlier world. Their knowledge is older than the cities built after disaster. This distinction mirrors the pattern seen in archaeology. The abrupt break, the disappearance of earlier cultures, the emergence of new ones with inherited yet transformed traditions. The Apkallu may be myth, but the structure of their story resembles a memory of transmission. Something lost, something saved, something passed on imperfectly. An even quieter motif appears in the way Sumerian myths describe time itself. Their stories do not imagine history as a straight path. They envision it as a series of ages, each with its own conditions, each separated by catastrophes or divine interventions. Time is cyclical, not linear. Knowledge rises, fades, resurfaces. Worlds end and begin without permanent continuity. This philosophical framework aligns with the archaeological record's repeated resets, floods, collapses, cultural shifts, and contrasts sharply with modern concepts of progress. Another thread woven through the myths is the idea of fragmentation, of something once whole that has since broken. In creation narratives, the world emerges from division. In flood stories, humanity splinters into survivors and forgotten peoples. In linguistic myths, speech fractures. In kingship myths, power shifts from city to city as though chased by an invisible tide. Everything moves, dissolves, reforms. Nothing remains static. This restlessness reflects a lived reality of unpredictability. Floods, droughts, invasions, but also suggests an older memory, one of deeper rupture. What makes these myths so evocative is not their supernatural elements, but the way they echo patterns found across global traditions. Stories of primordial sages, lost ages, catastrophic floods, cycles of destruction and renewal appear in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Scholars debate the reasons: shared psychological archetypes, parallel development, or traces of ancient migrations. But the Sumerian versions stand among the oldest written forms of these motifs, preserving a memory that may predate writing itself. Even the structure of Sumerian poetry, repetitive, incantatory, rhythmic, feels designed not to entertain but to preserve. It suggests oral transmission across vast spans of time, maintaining the skeleton of a story even as its details blur. These chants resemble rituals of remembrance rather than acts of imagination. They carry the sense that the storytellers were not inventing worlds, but holding on to fragments of something long gone. And perhaps the most haunting silence lies in what the myths do not say. For all their cosmic imagery, they avoid describing the world that existed before the earliest age. They hint at it through divine councils, primordial waters, pre-human beings, but never fully articulate it. This missing prelude mirrors the missing layers beneath Sumer's cities, the missing steps in the evolution of writing, the missing development of astronomical knowledge. Myth carries the absence gently, as if protecting something too fragile to articulate. In this way, the Sumerian myths behave like broken reflections of a shattered mirror, pieces scattered across time, each showing a different angle of the same lost world. Some reflect catastrophe, some reflect inheritance, some reflect memory softened into metaphor. None reflect the whole. But if myth compresses a memory of worlds that came before, then the next question drifts into the silence left by their disappearance. How did the Sumerians themselves fade? How does a civilization so foundational, so luminous, dissolve quietly into the background of history? Because the next veil of the story holds another mystery. Not how Sumer began, but how it ended. There is a strange gentleness in the way a civilization disappears. It rarely shatters in a single moment. Instead, it thins, softens, fades slowly at the edges, like a dream dissolving upon waking. And as the Sumerian myths whisper of cycles and forgotten worlds, the actual history of Sumer itself begins to behave in a similar way, blurring into silence long before archaeology can fully record its final breath. The end of Sumer is not a single event, not a single collapse, but a quiet unraveling that echoes the earlier patterns of erasure running through Mesopotamian time. And in that unraveling, another layer of the great mystery begins to surface. If one traces the arc of Sumer from its earliest cities to its final moments, the timeline resembles not a rise and fall, but a series of waves: growth, contraction, renewal, retreat. Even at its height, Sumer was a constellation of city-states rather than a unified empire, each with its own traditions, its own dynasties, its own sacred centers. Yet these centers behaved almost like living beings, subject to cycles of prosperity and decline. Uruk rose first, then faltered. Kish rose, then fell. Ur reached astonishing heights, then slowly dimmed. Each city flickered like a lamp in the desert night, bright for a moment, then dark, then lit again, but never quite with the same flame. When scholars speak of Sumer's end, they often point to environmental causes: salinization of the soil, depletion of farmland, the slow poisoning of the land by irrigation practices that brought salt to the surface. They describe river shifts that stranded once thriving cities far from their lifelines. They mention drought cycles identified in sediment cores, dry periods that stretched for decades or longer, placing unbearable stress on agriculture and population. These are real, tangible forces. They shape civilizations as surely as human ambition does. And yet, environmental explanations alone do not fully account for the complexity of Sumer's fading. The decline does not align neatly across regions. Some cities flourished while others starved. Some adapted while neighboring ones collapsed. And when Sumer finally passed into history as a distinct cultural force, it did not do so with the dramatic violence that marks other collapses. It dissolved gradually into the rise of later powers, Akkad, Ur III, Babylon, its language slowly giving way to Akkadian, its myths absorbed into new pantheons, its writing evolving but surviving. This quiet fading creates a peculiar tension. How does a civilization foundational enough to invent writing, astronomy, law, and monumental architecture simply drift into the background? How does something so central become something so distant? Part of the answer lies in the political fragmentation of Sumer. Its city-states were often embroiled in conflict, endless territorial disputes, shifting alliances, cycles of war and peace that drained resources and weakened collective resilience. The Sumerians recorded these conflicts obsessively. King lists, victory steles, temple hymns celebrating triumphs. But beneath the triumphal tone lies a subtle sense of exhaustion, centuries of competition wearing down the social fabric. Another subtle force was cultural integration. As Akkadian-speaking peoples moved into the south, the boundary between Sumerian and Akkadian life blurred. Trade interwove them, intermarriage connected them, administration merged languages. Over time, the two cultures fused so deeply that the distinction became almost impossible to maintain. Sumer did not vanish violently. It was absorbed gently, like a river merging into another stream. And yet, something about the absorption feels like a dimming, a loss not of people but of memory. But the deeper one looks, the more the disappearance of Sumer resembles the earlier anomalies, not merely decline, but erasure. Clay tablets from later periods often reference older texts that no longer exist. Rituals mention origins that have no surviving documentation. Temples rebuilt in later centuries contain fragments of earlier structures whose functions are no longer intelligible. Unlike ruins that crumble openly, Sumer's legacy dissolves from the inside out. Archives lost in palace fires, libraries destroyed in conflicts, entire genres of literature preserved only in secondary references. It is as if the final centuries of Sumer saw the same soft smudging at work as in the beginnings, knowledge thinning into silence. Some archaeologists point to a notable gap in material culture at the very end of Sumerian rule, an absence of innovation, a simplification of pottery and tools, a disappearance of earlier complexity. Others note abandoned neighborhoods in cities like Lagash and Umma, entire districts left empty, not because of war, but because of gradual depopulation. These quiet departures echo earlier abandonment layers buried beneath much older cities, suggesting a cyclical rhythm of movement and retreat etched into Mesopotamian time. There is also the matter of language. Sumerian, so distinctive and so ancient, became a ritual language long after it ceased to be spoken. It survived in temples, in scholarly texts, in incantations. But as a living language, it faded. The last bilingual dictionaries created by later scribes show signs of confusion. Scribes unsure how to interpret terms from their own ancestral past. This linguistic fading is not just a loss of words, it is the loss of conceptual categories, of ways of seeing the world. When a language vanishes, an entire mental universe vanishes with it. Perhaps the most haunting silence lies in the archaeological gaps during Sumer's final transition. The period between the fall of the Ur III dynasty and the rise of the Old Babylonian world contains pockets of missing data, sites not yet fully excavated, layers too disturbed to interpret, eras of unclear chronology. This gap is not large, but it is enough to blur the boundary between the end of one world and the beginning of another. The effect is subtle, like a page missing from a book. The story continues, but the tone has changed. When viewed from a distance, Sumer's disappearance resembles the earlier resets, abrupt in some places, gradual in others, always leaving behind a sense of something unresolved. And perhaps that is the deeper pattern. The Sumerians recorded cycles of destruction in their myths, not because they believed in divine retribution, but because they lived through cycles of collapse and renewal. Their stories became woven with the rhythms of the land itself. And yet, despite its fading, Sumer did not vanish completely. Its writing system survived. Its gods survived in new names. Its myths survived in transformed versions. Its astronomy survived in later compilations. Its legal principles survived in the Code of Hammurabi. Its influence pulses quietly beneath the surface of every civilization that followed. But the origins, the earliest chapters, remained blurred, just like the final ones. And this symmetrical blur, beginning and end softened, erased at the edges, creates a haunting impression that Sumer exists for us only at its midpoint, its brightest era. Everything before and after dissolves into silence, which leads gently, inevitably, to the next question. If so much remains unread, what lies in the tablets that have not yet been deciphered? The ones damaged, fragmented, or written in scripts we still cannot fully understand. Because the next veil of the journey is not about what we know, but about what remains locked in clay. There is a particular kind of silence that does not come from absence, but from possibility. A silence created not by what has been lost, but by what remains sealed, waiting, unread, half broken, half erased. And as the story moves from Sumer's fading toward what still survives of its memory, the clay tablets themselves shift from being quiet witnesses to something more enigmatic. Because not everything that has been excavated has been understood. Not everything written has been translated. And the tablets that remain unread behave like small dormant seeds from a world whose outline we can sense, but not yet fully see. Most listeners imagine that once a tablet is discovered, its secrets are revealed. But the truth is softer, more complicated. Thousands upon thousands of tablets remain untranslated, not because of lack of interest, but because of sheer volume, and because some tablets speak a language we do not understand at all. Others speak a language we think we understand, but the damage is too deep, the context too fractured. And still others use signs so archaic, so rare, that even specialists hesitate to assign meaning. Among the most mysterious are the Proto-Elamite and Proto-Cuneiform tablets, scripts older than the fully developed writing of Sumer. These tablets are covered in symbols that resemble accounting systems, ritual tallies, pictograms, and abstract markings. But despite decades of study, many remain undeciphered. They sit in museum drawers and storage shelves, their surfaces gently crumbling, while scholars continue to debate whether they represent true writing or a transitional stage of communication. What makes these protoscripts unsettling is not merely their age, but the abruptness with which they appear. They emerge suddenly during the late 4th millennium BCE, bloom intensely for a short period, then vanish just as abruptly, replaced by more standardized systems. This sudden rise and fall mirrors earlier patterns, the abrupt appearance of cities, symbols, astronomy, and the unexplained leaps beneath the foundations of temples like Eridu. It suggests that these protoscripts may be remnants of traditions older than the Sumerian script, fragments of a knowledge system whose roots extend into prehistory. In some of these tablets, the signs appear to reference quantities, objects, or titles that no longer exist. Without cultural continuity, the symbols become unmoored, floating anchors with no ship to hold. A picture of a vessel might mean water, or offering, or ritual, or status. A geometric mark might symbolize a clan, a deity, or a measurement. Scholars attempt to reconstruct meaning through comparison, but more often than not, they encounter a void, a fragment with no surviving context. Even within fully developed Sumerian and Akkadian tablets, many texts remain only partially understood. Some tablets are written in archaic forms of the language that differ significantly from later, more standardized versions. Others contain rare or unique compositions, incantations, hymns, astronomical notations that reference deities, stars, or rituals whose identities have been erased by time. A single missing sign can shift an entire translation. A single crack can turn meaning into ambiguity. Some tablets contain references to earlier works that have completely disappeared. A scribe might mention the old tablet, or refer to a source from before the flood, or cite a text of which only the ancients knew. These references hover at the edges of meaning like ghosts, indicating that the scribes themselves were aware of gaps in their knowledge. They hint that even in the 3rd millennium BCE, people were already living in the aftermath of forgotten worlds. Perhaps even more intriguing are the tablets whose purpose remains unknown. Scholars categorize them cautiously: lexical lists, omen tablets, mathematical exercises, administrative tallies. But the categories themselves often feel too modern, too rigid. A tablet filled with numbers might be an inventory or a ritual calculation. A list of symbols might be an instructional tool or a mnemonic for something sacred. The lens through which modern readers interpret these tablets may distort their true purpose, just as interpreting myth as literal narrative distorts its deeper meaning. Among the most enigmatic are the mathematical tablets. Some contain multiplication tables, square roots, geometric calculations, and surprisingly advanced algorithms. Others record astronomical cycles, eclipse predictions, or patterns of planetary motion. And in some cases, the level of sophistication appears unexpectedly high for the era. Scholars understand the content. What remains uncertain is the origin. Did these techniques emerge within Sumer, or were they inherited from earlier traditions now lost to archaeology? Mathematical knowledge does not appear out of nowhere. It builds. Yet here again, the early steps are missing. Then there are the mythological and ritual tablets with damaged openings. Tablets that begin mid-sentence, as if the first portions were lost long before they reached the hands of any modern scholar. Some stories refer to events in the days before the cities, in the time when the great waters still covered the land, or in the age when the sages walked among men. Without their opening sections, the stories become fragments of older narratives we can only guess at, like listening to the last notes of a song whose beginning has been swallowed by silence. Another troubling category consists of tablets whose signs do not correspond neatly to any known language. These are rare, but they exist. Isolated pieces recovered from marginal sites or transitional cultural zones. Some belong to scripts that died out before Sumerian literacy matured. Others may belong to local dialects or trade languages. A few appear almost entirely unique, suggesting either extremely localized traditions or remnants of cultures that vanished without leaving broader traces. These unread or partially read tablets behave like archaeological dark matter, evidence of something present but invisible. They imply earlier eras of literacy, or at least of symbolic communication, that did not survive intact. They suggest that writing, like cities, may have appeared, disappeared, and reappeared multiple times before the fully preserved records of Sumer begin. But perhaps the deepest silence lies not in the unread tablets themselves, but in the way they cluster around specific themes. Certain damaged fragments hint at cosmologies older than recorded myth, Others reference rituals whose logic no longer matches the known Sumerian pantheon. Some even hint at stories that do not align with the later standardized versions of Sumerian theology. Stories that feel out of place, older, belonging to a time before the flood narrative crystallized into a single authoritative form. And then there is the question of the tablets that have been lost entirely, the ones known only through later citations or mentioned in ancient catalogs, or indirectly referenced in ritual instructions. These lost works form an invisible library, a shadow archive that once shaped the religious and intellectual life of Mesopotamia, but has since slipped into oblivion. If even the preserved texts are incomplete, what of the ones we will never see? All of this creates a quiet, persistent tension. The more one learns about the tablets, the more one senses the vastness of what remains unread. The clay record is immense, yet incomplete. It is the surviving edge of a much larger body of memory that once existed. Memory carried through stone, through ritual, through oral tradition, through cycles of erasure and renewal. And if the unread tablets form the darkened corners of Sumerian memory, then perhaps the next step is to turn toward a different kind of text. Not clay, not stone, but cosmological poetry. A language that does not record events but encodes meaning, hinting at origins deeper than history. Because the deepest secrets of Sumer may not lie in what was written down, but in the creation hymns that whisper softly of worlds before the first word. There is a different kind of silence inside the oldest hymns, one that feels less like absence and more like deliberate concealment. These creation songs, preserved in fragments of clay and echoed through temple chants for thousands of years, behave like a veil drawn carefully over something ancient. They do not tell the story outright. They gesture toward it. They fold it into metaphors, encode it in rhythms, bury it beneath layers of symbolism. And as the narrative drifts into this quiet realm of cosmology, everything that has come before, forgotten layers beneath cities, vanished scripts, missing preludes, astronomical inheritances, begins to echo inside the myths themselves. The hymns do not contradict archaeology. They mirror its absences. When the Sumerians wrote of beginnings, they did not describe the birth of the world in linear terms. They spoke instead of emergence, things rising out of darkness, surfacing from unknown depths, taking shape from something already there but hidden. In the earliest cosmological texts, the universe begins not from nothing, but from mingled waters, the freshwater abyss below and the saltwater sea above. This dual water origin recurs across the region, but holds a deeper symbolism in Sumer. It is not merely the environment of Mesopotamia reflected in myth. It is a memory structure, a way of describing an unknowable past by giving it shape through metaphor. The freshwater deep, the Abzu, is particularly important. It lies beneath the earth, inaccessible, ancient, a realm of wisdom and creation. The god Enki, lord of this deep, is not a creator in the modern sense. He is a revealer. His wisdom is not invented. It is drawn forth from the waters. And in this symbolic language, one sees the same pattern that appears in the earliest cities and earliest tablets. Knowledge does not ascend upward through human innovation. It descends or emerges, as if uncovered from an older layer. The creation hymns rarely describe the process of creation itself. Instead, they enumerate the me, the fundamental principles of civilization: kingship, craftsmanship, truth, music, weaving, judgment, language structure. These are treated not as cultural developments, but as cosmic components that existed before humans, before cities. Their transmission to humanity is described in mythic terms, but the implication is subtle. The Sumerians did not see themselves as inventors of civilization. They believed they were inheritors. Another fragmentary hymn speaks of a time before the names of things were fixed. In this pre-linguistic era, the world existed but was undefined. Concepts moved like mist. Meanings had not yet crystallized. The hymn does not try to describe this era. It only gestures toward it with poetic vagueness, as if even the act of naming it would distort its true nature. This resonates deeply with the archaeological gaps, the thousands of years between symbolic stone culture and the sudden emergence of Sumerian writing, the missing intermediate stages that seem too foundational to have simply vanished. The Sumerians also preserved the idea of multiple creations. Their world was not made once. It was ordered, disrupted, reordered, cycles reflecting the flood layers in the soil. The tablets hint at ages before the known age, each ending in dissolution. Some hymns mention catastrophic resets without giving details. Others mention beings who existed before the black-headed people, the Sumerian term for themselves. These beings are not described. Their attributes remain hazy. It is as if the scribes remembered only the echoes of an older cosmology, but not its imagery. Then there are the succession myths, which describe divine generations overturning each other. Old orders replaced by new ones. Cosmic power shifting like political power among cities. Scholars interpret these myths as reflections of societal change. But their underlying structure, older regimes erased and rewritten, knowledge preserved selectively, transitions happening abruptly, mirrors the discontinuities seen in archaeology. It suggests that the mythic imagination was shaped by recurring historical ruptures. One creation hymn, the Kesh Temple hymn, offers a tantalizing detail. It describes the original sacred cities as founded in days of old, when the world was still young. The phrase is vague, yet the tone is one of reverence toward something not fully understood even by its own authors. The hymn lists arts, offices, and cosmic regulations as if they pre-existed humanity. It describes humanity as stepping into a framework already built. This matches the archaeological reality. The earliest Sumerian cities do not look like experiments. They look like continuations. Even more suggestive is the Enuma Elish in its later Babylonian form, which preserves older Sumerian elements. In this epic, creation is violent, born from conflict among primordial beings. Older forces are subdued, replaced by younger ones. The older generation becomes part of the world's structure, embedded in it, hidden beneath it. This symbolism echoes the physical layers beneath cities like Eridu and Uruk. Older foundations submerged beneath newer constructions, not erased, but absorbed. The hymns also contain obscure references to the days before destinies were fixed, a phrase scholars still debate. Destinies, cosmic laws, the me, the structure of order, exist independently of the gods themselves in some texts. This implies a world even older than the divine order the myths describe, a metaphysical layer beneath mythology. In symbolic terms, it resembles a cultural memory of something older than the pantheon, a metaphysical attempt to articulate a vanished epoch. Across multiple hymns, there is a recurring theme of recovery. Gods retrieve lost items, lost knowledge, lost order. Sometimes they descend into the underworld to retrieve something from a deeper realm. Sometimes they consult tablets of destiny, objects containing cosmic regulation. The idea that the order of the world can be forgotten and then found again suggests a view of civilization not as a linear ascent, but as an ebb and flow, a memory that can fade and be restored. This cyclical perception becomes even more pronounced in the hymns that describe creation through separation. Heaven and earth are not created ex nihilo. they are separated from a primordial unity. Light is separated from darkness, land from sea, order from chaos. These separations feel less like inventions and more like clarifications. Something existed in an undifferentiated state. Creation is the act of making it knowable. The symbolic resonance with archaeology is striking. Ancient layers blurred together, later layers clarifying, cities rising by separating themselves from what came before, yet always building atop forgotten ground. What remains most haunting, however, are the gaps within the hymns themselves. Many creation texts begin abruptly, their openings missing. Others end mid-sentence. Some reference earlier hymns that no longer survive. These missing sections, lost not by willful erasure but by time, behave like the missing layers beneath the temples, the missing proto-writing, the missing transitional cultures. They represent absences that shape the narrative as much as presence does, and through these silences, a larger pattern emerges. The Sumerians saw their own world as a continuation of something far older. Their creation hymns do not describe a beginning. They describe a re-beginning. But if myth preserves the shadows of older worlds, and if cosmology encodes memories beyond the reach of history, then the final step in this journey must turn toward the quietest mystery of all, the silence before the first word, the moment where history dissolves back into darkness. Because the last part of the story is not about what was known, but about what remains unreachable. There is a moment, near the edge of every long journey, when the path no longer feels like a line but a circle, when every fragment of the story begins to drift back toward its beginning. And as the Sumerian world dims into the soft half-light of memory, as the myths, the stones, the cities, and the unread tablets settle into the quiet of what cannot be fully known, something else emerges. Not an answer, not a revelation, but a feeling. A soft, almost imperceptible awareness that beneath everything, beneath the clay, beneath the flood layers, beneath the broken symbols, there lies a deeper silence. A silence older than Sumer, older than the first city, older than the first name pressed into wet clay. A silence that does not speak because it predates the very idea of speaking. Perhaps this is why the Sumerian records carry such an uncanny resonance. They never claim to be the first story. They never insist that humanity began with them. Instead, they gesture backwards, toward shadows they themselves could not decipher. Their king's list begins not with invention, but with descent. Their myths begin not with creation, but with emergence. Their temples stand on foundations older than the people who worshipped there. Their earliest writing preserves systems already mature. Everything about Sumer hints at a prelude that has vanished. This is the paradox that lingers as one moves into the final veil of the story. History begins in Sumer because that is where the surviving record begins. But the record itself behaves like a mid-chapter, not a first page. And the silence before that page, whatever world existed there, has left only the faintest impressions. When archaeologists peel back the layers beneath Eridu, beneath Uruk, beneath the flood deposits and temple floors, they find traces too quiet to form a narrative. Hearths without context, tools without culture, architecture without ancestry. These fragments do not contradict the Sumerian story. They simply fail to clarify it. They feel like the residue of worlds that rose and dissolved before writing learned to capture them. The same pattern appears in the sky. The constellations mapped by the earliest astronomers are already precise, already named, already woven into rituals. The system shows no sign of invention, only inheritance. It is as if the sky had been read long before the scribes of Sumer inscribed its patterns. And yet, the earliest star names give no clear window into their origins. They stand like stones smoothed by water, shaped by forces we cannot see. The myths echo this structure. They speak of ages before the known age, beings who lived before humans, sages who instructed before the flood. But they never describe these ages in detail. They refer to them only through metaphor, shadowy figures walking in a landscape of symbolic imagery. It is as though the storytellers remembered only the emotional texture of something older, a world both vast and fragile, luminous and dissolving. A world whose memory could be carried only in poetry, never in prose. Even the unread tablets, those silent pieces of clay that sit in storage rooms, feel like fragments of a much larger library lost to time. They behave like broken windows into a darkness that resists illumination. The signs on them are traces, hints, echoes. They suggest writing systems that flickered into existence, shone for a moment, then were swallowed again by flood, conflict, or forgetfulness. These proto-scripts exist at the threshold between language and symbol, between meaning and silence. Their very incompleteness feels intentional, as though they were never meant to be entirely recovered. And when one steps back from all these fragments, stones, myths, sky maps, tablets, ruins, a single impression begins to take shape. Not a theory, not a conclusion, a feeling, subtle and unsettling, that civilization may not have begun once, but many times. That knowledge may not have climbed upward in a simple arc, but may have risen and fallen in waves, each leaving behind faint traces for the next world to reinterpret. That the story of humanity may contain long intervals of silence, eras erased so completely that only symbolic echoes survived. The Sumerians seemed to understand this deeply, even if they could not articulate it openly. Their worldview was one of cycles, creation, dissolution, recreation. Their kingship descended from elsewhere, was extinguished, then descended again. Their myths preserved memories of catastrophic resets. Their rituals revived forgotten knowledge. Their cities rose on earlier cities as if trying to rebuild something half-remembered. Perhaps this is why Sumer feels less like a beginning and more like an emergence. Like the moment when the tide pulls back just enough to reveal the remnants of something older beneath the surface. Not enough to reconstruct the world that came before, but enough to sense its outline. And in the softest, quietest spaces of this story, a question lingers. Not loud enough to demand an answer, not sharp enough to disturb sleep, but persistent in its curiosity. A question that does not accuse or speculate, but simply wonders. If Sumer was the first civilization we can clearly see, what was the last civilization we can no longer see? What forms did their knowledge take? What stories did they tell? What skies did they observe? What floods washed their names away? What ruins lie beneath the ruins we have already uncovered? And how much of what the Sumerians called inheritance was actually the fading memory of a world that disappeared long before clay tablets existed? No tablet answers. No myth clarifies. No excavation reveals the full shape of what was lost. Only the silence remains. Quiet, expansive, patient. A silence that stretches backward beyond the first word and forward beyond the last excavation. A silence that cradles the forgotten beginnings of human thought, and perhaps its forgotten ends as well. And somewhere within that silence, between the worlds that vanished and the ones that remain, lies a truth we sense more than understand. A truth that waits not to be discovered, but to be remembered.